Okay, Nadine Lefebvre, it is all yours.
Well, good morning and welcome. Today, our presentation is by Gina Dionne. She is an Alaska master gardener and has been growing fresh, organic food in urban settings for over 20 years. She specializes in container and indoor gardens and has grown everything from bountiful chef gardens on her back deck to fresh herbs and juicy tomatoes right in her kitchen. So Gina Marie, welcome, and it's all yours.
Thank you so much for having me. Hi, everyone. My name again is Gina Dionne, and I'm going to go ahead and put my contact information in the chat box. And since we're using the chat box today, I want to make sure everybody knows how to access that. So at the bottom of your
Gina, you're mute.
Thank you. I clicked mute and then I clicked unmute and then I muted myself again. All right. Hey there, everyone. Now that we've got my voice here, I'm Gina Dionne. I am actually a program assistant with the Cooperative Extension Service. And so we are the community branch of UAF here in Anchorage. We have an office. We have offices all over the state. And I'm super excited to be here with you today. I'm going to go ahead and put my contact information in the chat box. And just to make sure everyone knows where the chat box is and how to access it, if you look at the bottom of your screen, if you're actually in Zoom watching with us live, instead of just live streaming, you can go ahead and hover over the bottom. You'll see a little button with the chat bubble on it. Click that and it will open up a chat window somewhere on your screen. And so to start off, I want everyone to just tell me briefly where you're watching from. Is it in Anchorage? Is it somewhere else in the state? I love to see different gardeners because everyone, even in Anchorage, has a different microclimate. So I am across the street from the botanical gardens, if you've ever been there. But I live at the bottom of a valley and the botanical gardens is a little bit more elevated up on the hillside. And it's surprising the difference in when my flowers start to bloom and when theirs do. So there's a significant difference even within walking distance in your own neighborhoods. So again, like I said, I will go ahead and put my contact information. It will also be made available to you if you ever have questions about gardening. I'm the person to reach out to here in Anchorage, and I'm always happy to help. I love experienced and beginner gardeners. I lead the Master Gardener class here in Anchorage, and it's a passion of mine. So hopefully that will come through today. Today, I'm going to be referencing this publication, which is put out from the from the Cooperative Extension Service. I don't know if the writing is backwards for you, but it is for me.
Alex, do you have an update for us from the retention team?
So we'll make sure.
I don't have too much.
I believe that someone is unmuted.
Yeah, we will monitor that for you, Gina. Sorry, my apologies for that. We'll be sure to try to catch that as quickly as we can.
All right, let's go ahead and move on. This is the reference that we have. We have these copies in the office if you want to swing by and pick up a hard copy, or you'll be getting a link in that follow-up letter to let you know where you can download it yourself. And this is entirely free.
And Gina, just to remind everyone, if they do have questions, we'd like everyone to put their questions in chat. Thank you, Gina, so much for describing how to use the chat function. And we'll be sure and get to those questions at the end. So you're able to go ahead and go through your presentation and we'll have you answer as many questions as we have time for at the end.
Perfect. Thank you. All right, let's dive right in. I've got a lot to cover and I did shorten it to fit this class. But sometimes that means I'm going to rush through something. And that's why having the chat box loaded and ready for questions is a fantastic option. That way you don't forget by the time I'm done talking what you wanted to ask. And today specifically, I'm going to be talking about my passion, the way I've gardened for over 25 years, container gardens. And so it started with me living in apartments, and in apartments, you can't obviously dig up the ground without your landlord's permission. And the same is, I'm sure, true of many of the other housing facilities here in Anchorage. You have either a small spot of land that you can use, or you have a deck and really nothing else. So container gardens are a really great alternative when you don't have a traditional gardening space. It does take a different mindset though, especially if you've done traditional gardening in the ground. You have to learn to embrace your space and look at it for what it's able to offer you, not as what limitations your space has. Really, to garden effectively, all you need is light, containers, soil, water, and of course, plants, and your time and your effort and your love of what you're doing. So let's talk a little bit about containers. Containers can be fancy. Like this is a 3-pack of containers I bought at Costco, I think last weekend. And this is the perfect size for tomatoes, peppers, your larger root plants. You can also use paint, 5-gallon paint containers. And they now have flexible felt containers. And hopefully you can see me in the little side window and I'm not just showing off all these cool things. And you can plant right in these felt containers. And the nice thing is if you have an insect problem, like I had mites one year because I brought some plants home from a garden center and unfortunately brought the little critters with me. I took my soil, dumped it out to refresh it, shook them out really well, these felt bags, tossed them in my washer, and then took them out and placed them on top of a nursery pot so they would hold their shape. And these are also another really great, inexpensive option for containers. They're large, they have really good drainage at the bottom, and they're inexpensive. And then I had clean, bug-free felt bags. But if you don't want to buy felt bags, in many places, Alaska Mill and Feed, most of the garden centers here in Anchorage, and I'm sure local garden centers, I know Ken's Garden Center in Wasilla, they have the felt pots. But if you can't find them or you just don't want to invest in them, maybe it's your first year, one of these cloth shopping bags is a really great alternative. If you know someone who has chickens or livestock, the pet feed bags are also fantastic. Just make sure your containers have 2 things. They need to have plenty of drainage. So if you don't have drainage already built in, like if you're using a 5-gallon paint bucket or a 5-gallon food bucket, you will need to drill holes because it won't come with drainage. So that's the first thing you need. And the second thing is you want your container to be opaque. And so if you have a clear container, because technically you could take a milk jug and you can use it as a container, but because the light will be able to get through to the roots, you're going to have algae growing in your soil, and that's going to compete for nutrients. So you want to make sure your containers are opaque, and they could be anything. They can be sour cream containers for smaller plants like herbs. This is a popcorn bucket from one of the movies we went to see. So really, you can be really creative and not spend a whole lot of money on your containers. The other thing you need is plants. We're going to talk about those specifically in a few slides, so hang with me on that. But let's talk about the different spots you can garden in. Excuse me, I'm a little bit, I think allergies are starting to come back. We have sun, but with that, we also have pollen. All right, so some of the places you can garden indoors, check out the layout of your windows. If you have a south or west facing window, those are going to be good. Even an east facing window will have good morning sun for you to plant in your windowsill. If you have a bright sunny kitchen, you might be able to plant on your kitchen counter with or without supplemental lighting, and I'll talk about that in just a bit. But really anywhere that's warm with good airflow and good lighting will work indoors. So outdoor garden spots, you can use a sunny deck, you can use your yard and still plant with containers in your yard. For example, if you can't dig a garden, but you still want to have a garden out there, use containers. That way you can clean them up if the landowner says, hey, I'm bringing people through, you need to get some of that stuff out of the way, you can do it. Rooftop gardens are very popular. In fact, I've seen new construction here in Anchorage that includes rooftop areas for socialization, and they make a perfect place to garden. Hanging baskets and window boxes, don't forget about those. They're not just for flowers. You can also grow vegetables in them. So when I first moved to Anchorage, I was in a little condo. We had no yard. We had a driveway. And so it was my first year. I came from I lived in Florida and Texas half my life. And so I was used to gardening there, even though I started gardening in Rhode Island. So a little bit closer to our climate. I had to have tomatoes. So I grabbed myself a container. I planted myself a tomato plant. And that first season, I ended up with a really abundant harvest of grape tomatoes. So even in a driveway that's completely devoid of life, if it's in the right place, if it's getting the right kind of light, you're going to have a wonderful garden experience. But when you're deciding whether you want to garden indoors or outdoors in containers, you really have to consider the pros and the cons. And there are pros and cons for each of them. So let's talk about that very briefly. Indoors, the great thing about growing indoors is you can control the environment. If you don't want bugs, if you don't want to have a mite problem or an aphid problem, if you're growing indoors, you have a lot more control of that. It's easily accessible. For example, if I'm making a salad for dinner and I want to grab some fresh lettuce or some fresh parsley to chop up in it and maybe some cherry tomatoes, I can just walk across my kitchen and grab those from my baker's rack where I have all of my tomatoes set up. So it's accessible. And I know, at least for myself, if I can see it, I'm more likely to keep up with watering and things like that. So the accessibility is also good for care. And it's relatively easy to start. You don't need to spend a lot on containers. You can just use what you have. And of course, the best part, no weeds. Unless you leave a door open, and even then it would be very unlikely weed seeds would get into your garden. There are some bad things. You do have to worry about having inadequate lighting. If you don't have enough lighting, your plants will fail to thrive. They may not even fruit or flower, depending on what you're growing. So be aware that if you don't have enough light, you can supplement that with an additional lamp. And the LED lighting that has become more popular is a lot less expensive and a lot more effective than it was even 3 years ago. So I've transitioned completely over to LED shop lights. And no, they're not expensive plant lights. Please don't feel like you have to go out and spend $800 to $1,000 on a plant light, because they will charge you because it says plant light. You can use a shop light that you would get for your garage, and it's going to work great. White light's all you need. If you're growing indoors, sometimes space is a problem. For example, I had to kind of cut back on my houseplant so I could have room for my garden. And every year it's kind of a juggle of where am I going to put my houseplants now that I have to put my vegetables in that space. And then of course, there's pollination problems. You probably don't have a lot of pollinators living in your home. If you do, that might be a different problem for a different expert out of our office. So you will have to be the pollinator, especially for things like peppers and tomatoes and zucchini, especially anything that needs cross-pollination. And of course, the really bad part is indoors, since you have less airflow, you have less light, you can very easily encounter disease. We talked a bit about failure to thrive, and that's when your plant is just not doing well because of it's not getting what it needs. And when plants are weakened like that, they are more likely to have pest problems. So you might have your garden indoors, but it's next to, for example, mine's next to a sliding glass window. And we're in and out, and the screen is pretty small, especially for bugs like mites and aphids. They can get through those small spaces. You could end up with an insect problem indoors. Or if you bring a plant from, say, a nursery and it's already infected, it can infect the other plants indoors. So pests aren't necessarily something you absolutely will not have indoors. You may end up with them indoors. And when they do come in, they have a tendency to really thrive because the conditions of your home are probably really good for most insects to thrive in. Now, if you want to grow outdoors, but don't have a traditional space to garden, there's some really great advantages to that. You've got your natural light, so you don't have to supplement. You've got pollinators, so you don't have to take the time to pollinate your vegetables and herbs if you're growing herbs indoors. And you've got rain and wind, which not only adds additional water, but wind acts as a strengthener, and it creates airflow around the plant, and those kinds of things are going to keep disease and insects at bay. So, and it's going to give you a stronger, more resilient plant. And so you don't have those things when you're gardening indoors. The bad, well, we live in Alaska and it snowed yesterday. And today I'm looking outdoors and that snow's already gone, but you never know. And so Alaska weather can be pretty unpredictable. And we had snow here. In another area of Anchorage, they could have had just nice sunny weather. So it can be a real deterrent when growing outdoors. It does tend to require more time and effort because you have to go out to your garden space. You have to make sure you have everything you need there. And you do have to worry about both sunburn and wind burn. And that's when your plants are getting too much sun or they're getting too much wind and they either break or burn, and you end up with damaged plants because they're not protected enough. Nutrient deficiencies can also be problematic. We have soil that tends to run a little bit acidic, and it tends to have a good deal of shale and clay in it, not clay, slate in it. And so because of that, it will be a little bit harder for your plants to get nutrients compared to, say, potting soil that you would use. So I highly recommend don't dig up soil from your yard if you're growing outdoors in containers. You still want to use a good potting mix, a blend that is specific for pots, because you're going to need that extra nutrition you're going to get out of that potting soil, and the head start those roots need to really get established. For me, when things are growing outside, I tend to forget and go outside and go, oh no, aphids, or oh no, I've got, a bug problem or weeds, because I haven't checked on them in a few days. So that can be a disadvantage of having your garden out of sight. And finally, you're going to deal with the same problems, disease, pests, but instead of failure to thrive, you might end up having overcrowding because your plants are doing too well, or they're competing with weeds. So slightly different, but basically both are going to require your care and attention. The great news is that's so fun. That's like the best part, taking care of your garden. It's awesome. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about indoor gardens. Do you guys know how to use the reaction to raise your hands? Go ahead and put into chat right now for me whether you're interested in growing indoors, outdoors, or both. So go ahead and type that into chat, and I'll see it after we start to do questions at the end. And I'll go ahead and start talking about ways you can make your indoor container gardens better. So one, you want to select the right size container for what you're growing. And this is a good example. So this is something I would grow perhaps parsley or basil in. It's a small sour cream or cottage cheese. It's cottage cheese container. I would go ahead and drill holes to make sure I had enough drainage. But this is a good size pot for herbs, or even small lettuce gardens can be in one of these, especially if you have children or grandchildren and you want to do gardening activities with them. Then they can take a little garden home with them. That's always a great thing. But for example, if I'm growing tomatoes, I am going to want a larger bucket, either this size or larger. And the same goes for peppers, zucchinis, but not all tomatoes fall into that. And we'll talk about that in a few slides when I talk about specific plant options. You'll need a good quality potting mix that has enough drainage and it's light enough and for those roots to really get established. And keep in mind, the only nutrition those plants are going to get come from you, because they're in a container, they're cut off from their environment. So if they're sitting on the ground, any nutrients in the ground are useless to it. If they're on your windowsill, well, of course they're not going to get nutrients. So you have to provide those nutrients through regular fertilization. You also need to have drainage, and you're going to hear me say that over and over and again, because root rot is a real problem in containers, and it's caused by overwatering. The roots get saturated and they start to rot, and then the plant ends up either falling over without roots or it just turns brown And a lot of people think, oh, I'm underwatering because my leaves are turning brown, but that's actually too much water, and it's the roots that are having a problem, and that's reflecting in the leaves. So overwatering is the biggest problem I see people come in to talk to me about in container gardens. You're going to want to use specific varieties that are small enough for containers. Again, we'll talk about that in a few. And you're going to have to prune and pollinate just like you would in a regular garden. A little bit more perhaps, because you want to keep your plant in that small container. You're going to need to kind of prune it back and make sure it doesn't get out of hand, because then you won't be able to provide enough nutrients in that small container for the plant. And again, if you need to have additional lighting, that's always great. This is that same first condo that I rented when we moved here. We had a beautiful south facing, this is that driveway. South facing windows above that driveway. And this is a complete herb and salad garden. I have carrots in here. I have a couple different kinds of lettuce, herbs, and even some kale and Swiss chard in there. So you can grow lots of things right in a windowsill. Here are some other examples of indoor gardens that I've grown over the years. This is a pepper plant, and it's actually called a violet sparkle pepper. It's specifically a single lobed small growing plant, so it fits really well in containers and will still produce tons of fruit. As you can see, I think I took this picture in March and it already had flowers, because of course I started it well before the season, the gardening season actually started. This is a tomato plant in a hanging garden next to my kitchen window, and this is called a tumbling Tom, or tumbling. They usually have the word tumblers or tumbling somewhere in and that's because they actually grow down like a house plant. And so they're really great for indoor tomatoes because you can plant them where you would normally have house plants as long as you have enough light. And then you don't have to worry about staking them, because the fruits and the branches are just going to flow down the side, and you can harvest like that. Strawberries are also really great for that reason, because they will just drape over the side. They don't get dirty, and you can just reach up and grab one when you need one. You can have citrus trees. This is a lemon and a lime tree in a container. And this is my November harvest of cherry tomatoes in my indoor hydro garden. That's a garden that does not use soil. It simply uses water that's being pushed through the system and oxygenated. And again, this is in November. And so I have fresh tomatoes. I have to have fresh tomatoes year round indoors. So let's switch tracks a little bit and talk about outdoor container gardens. So the second year that I lived in that condo, before we bought our home, I still didn't have a real garden place, but I was really happy with the way that first tomato harvest came out. So this time I planted a couple tomatoes in this really large, you'll probably recognize these. They sell them in all the garden centers. They're really large pots. This is a little overcrowded. And I did end up with an insect problem because I had too many plants in it. I got excited. I had too much plant for the space that I was planting in. So you definitely want to have the right size container for what you're planning to grow. Now this is a zucchini plant. And I decided, oh, I'm going to plant some peas in there too, because it'll be great. They'll grow up and the zucchini will grow out and they won't compete with each other. Well, no, they certainly competed with each other, at least at the root level. And so I think maybe I got 3 peas pea pods out of this entire pea plant. And it ended up just shriveling up and dying back because the zucchini just absolutely loved this setup. And let's see, that was one of the first zucchinis I harvested from this container. I have one that's the size of my leg, but I usually don't show that one because you can see my toes, and they're all the manicure on my toes was just terrible. So you get to see the one that's as big as my arm. We talked about potting mix. We talked about overwatering. Because this was a south-facing driveway and it was on a driveway which reflected a lot of heat and got really hot, because of that, I ended up having to water more than I would have perhaps if it was in a southeast facing area, or if it was on grass or some other type of surface that's not going to reflect as much heat back up. We're going to talk about varieties in just a minute. And of course, you'll want to weed and prune. I ended up pruning out the pea plant, and I ended up pruning out the majority. I had to really take this apart. I still got a good harvest from it, but it wasn't quite, this was the harvest from that container that year. And so it probably would have been the same or better if it was one plant, would have probably produced that much. And then I could have had 2 pots and had twice as many. So containers need to match the size of what you're trying to grow. And I love showing this off because people are like, oh, can we only grow like lettuce and tomatoes? And no, this is a spaghetti squash in the same container. So when we moved into our new home, I, of course, added some pots. I ended up turning our deck into a outdoor garden space as well. And I recycled this pot and I planted spaghetti squash in it. I used leftover sunflower stems from the year before as a trellis. And as you can see, this is about a 1 pound spaghetti squash. And the variety is called Small Wonder Spaghetti Squash. And we'll talk about varieties in just a second. Let's show you some other outdoor options. Greenhouses are a fantastic option, and I never know where to put greenhouses because technically they're indoor spaces, but they also have a lot in common with the outdoor spaces as well. If you're going to be growing things like tomatoes and cucumbers and really want a vast harvest, you're going to need to grow in some kind of greenhouse environment. This is a small greenhouse that's attached to the back of my house. It has a southeast facing, my yard faces southeast in this area. As you can see, there's one of my chickens checking on the plants and making sure they're all right. And I've got 4 of the tumbling toms. As you can see, they're starting to drape over the way they do. These are regular determinate tomatoes, and you're going to want to use determinate tomatoes in containers. You don't have to, you can use indeterminate, but if you're starting off, determinate tomatoes don't get as long and viney as other varieties do. You can always give me a call and we can talk about varieties in more detail. And then these are cucumbers in a hanging basket over here. This is this is kale and Swiss chard in those old window boxes I was using in my windows. Some beautiful strawberries, which grow great in containers. Herb gardens, these are potatoes. And if you don't want to put your potatoes directly in old tires, you can line them. And this is true of anything. If you're using wood, like for example, pressure treated wood, and you're worried about those chemicals leaching into your food, line it with plastic. Just make sure you add drainage at the bottom. And then this is a cucumber plant in a container. And so these are just some of the ways. These are those felt bags I was talking about earlier. This is, I believe, a nursery pot in a hanging basket. And these are just regular hanging baskets, I think 12-inch hanging baskets that I bought at one of the local grocery stores. So you can use a lot of different types of containers for your gardens, different sizes, different materials. It really is flexible. So I promised that I would talk about varieties. And so here we go. This is exciting because there has been a real surge in interest in container gardening. And because of that, there have been so many varieties that have been developed specifically for small containers. And so this is a list of just some of them. If you want to take a snapshot with your phone of this list, I went ahead to different seed companies and found specifically labeled container varieties. And as you can see, we've got everything here from squash. We've got even that spaghetti squash I was talking about. We've got eggplant. We've got cabbage. We've got watermelons. Guys, watermelons. If you have a greenhouse and you want to try to grow a watermelon or cantaloupe, you can do that because in a container, we now have varieties that are small enough to thrive in that small environment. And when you're looking in your seed catalogs, sometimes they'll even have a full page spread because, like I said, container gardens are a really popular thing. And because it's popular, A lot of different companies are jumping on board. This is the micro tom tomato, and it literally can grow in a 4 to 6 inch pot, and it only gets about 6 inches high. So these are perfect for kitchen windows. This is a type of zucchini called Astia, and it's from Renee Seeds, and Renee Seeds loves, this is their entire catalog of container varieties. It's 2 pages. This will grow really well in pots. They also have miniature cabbages. So you could always grow things like kale and your different brassicas that are loose leaf. But if you wanted a compact head for a cabbage, a more traditional cabbage, this is a container variety that literally grows to the size of the palm of your hands. You're not going to win any contests at the state fair with this, but you can also grow them. And especially if you're like me, and now that it's just my husband and I now, and he's not a huge vegetable eater, small cabbages like this is perfect because I don't use as much. He really doesn't like cabbage anyway. So these were a perfect option for me because not really a fan of sauerkraut. I know it's terrible. I can make it and it's good. I just never have grown a taste for it. And as you can see, different catalogs also. These are peppers, different varieties of peppers that will grow in containers. And you can look for on the write-up, either they'll specifically say container variety, or they'll say compact, space saving. I'm not sure if that's me with the feedback. But hopefully you guys can hear me clearly. So it will usually indicate on the seed packet or in the catalog that an item is friendly or able to be grown in a container. And sometimes it will actually show them growing in a container on the seed packet. Some more traditional things that do well in containers and have been grown in containers for years and years and years. Herbs. A lot of people have indoor herb gardens. My first garden when I was in college, moved out, got my own apartment, going to college, so it was busy. But I planted fresh herbs in my kitchen windows so I could, because I love to cook. So for me, having fresh herbs is something I have to have. But like I said, even things like potatoes, if you use small potatoes, you can grow those in containers. They sell bags specifically sized for tomatoes or potatoes. Strawberries have always been grown in baskets and they do really well in hanging baskets. And any kind of microgreen you can grow in a really small container. But like I said, you're not going to have cabbages like this in your container garden. This was grown in a traditional raised bed. And this is Malcolm. He is my garden helper, and he makes sure that I'm out and about and taking care of my plants. And so he wanted to pose with this cabbage. I was so proud of it. It didn't win an award, but it was a lot larger than the ones that I grow in a container. Unfortunately, I don't have any pictures of those. But this is my contact information. Like I said, I think I shared it in the chat at the beginning, and I'll go ahead and post it again in the chat. And you can always reach me. Email's the fastest and easiest way to reach me, but you can also grab me by phone. And I'm super excited. I see that there's lots of questions in chat, so I'm super excited to kind of close this out a little bit and start looking at those questions. So
Gina, this is Daryl, and yes, we do have a number of questions in chat. So if you can you leave your contact information up there for just a few minutes? Will we
absolutely.
First, thank you so much. So just starting with the chat questions, I'm just going to go through them here. First one, if we're using soil from last year's containers, how do you recommend prepping it for the upcoming season?
That is an excellent question. And I'm so glad that you asked that because it's actually not intuitive. So if you plant in the same soil year after year, eventually the soil is going to get depleted and the organic matter in it's going to break down. So what I do is at the end of the season, all right, let's be honest, in the spring, because at the end of the season, I'm usually too busy preserving and canning. But in the spring, I take all my soil from all of my containers and dump it onto a tarp. And then I add about 1/3 of that volume of compost into that, and I mix it all up. If I end up going and buying more soil because I purchased a couple more containers, which I have a tendency to do, then I'll go ahead and add that fresh soil to that big mound, mix it up really well, and then use that mound of soil to refill my containers. And so that way I'm adding new compost, new organic material. I add any kind of pelleted or granular fertilizer at that time as well. But I do have to warn you about pelleted fertilizers in containers because they contain salts. They can end up making your soil an inhospitable place. So I may add a little bit of time release fertilizer into that mound, but the majority of my fertilization is water soluble fertilizers. And that I mix up and I feed the plant weekly. So that's how I prep my soil and make sure that it stays fresh and viable.
Great. And just want to remind everyone, if you do have a question, please use the chat function and go ahead and drop your question into chat. We'll get to as many questions as we can today. The next question is potting mix or potting soil. What is the difference?
The name. Really? So none of the potting mixes that you're gonna purchase say potting soil anymore. Well, I don't think they do, because soil is indicative of inorganic material without the organic component. So soil, as a technical term, is the non-living part of healthy soils. So we've got that. And before, that's what they basically sold. Now, a lot of times they'll have microorganisms in there. They might have mycorrhizae as part of that potting mix. So generally speaking, your potting mix is also going to include not just soil, but it's going to include some biologicals, some fertilizers, and some kind of drainage material like perlite or vermiculite, which makes the soil lighter and makes it not hold as much water, because you don't want your containers to hold a lot of water. And if you use native soil in your containers, they will hold a lot of water in them. And that's when you end up with root rot. So excellent question. Thank you.
Great. And speaking of containers, Gina, I think you were talking about some gardening boxes that you had shown earlier in your presentation. And we have a question about how deep are those boxes?
It depends on the plant. But keep in mind that most plants don't need more than 12 inches of soil for their root balls. And even that sometimes, especially in dwarf varieties, is a lot. So if you take your micro tom tomatoes, you'll notice their roots are only about 4 to 6 inches deep. And so these can go in a more shallow pot. These could even go in that, where's that sour cream container? I lost my sour cream, guys. Oh, there it is. So these could actually grow in this. And generally speaking, the height of the plant is going to be a good idea of how deep those roots are going to go. Of course, if you got vines like pumpkins or tomatoes that are viney, they're going to be obviously much taller than the root ball is going to be. But for the most part, that's a good place to start, is how big is the majority of that plant. Its root ball is probably going to be about the same size.
And speaking of containers, next question, is it okay to use pots that you can fill from the bottom?
Absolutely.
Okay.
You can water from the bottom. And a lot of people do that more so for herbs and houseplants, but you can absolutely do that with vegetables as well.
All right. And next question is about the term that you mentioned earlier. And that question is, what is a microgreen?
A microgreen is basically broccoli, radishes, mustards that come and you eat them. Let me go back to that one, actually. So you plant them, and before these are all what I would call seedlings. What is shown here are their first leaves. And you want to eat microgreens at this point. But if you let these plants go, they would grow into full-size watercress or full-size broccoli or full-size radishes. It's just that you're eating them before they reach maturity. So they're still in their infancy. And they contain a lot of vitamins in a very small amount of space, because those, and if you've ever had bean sprouts are a microgreen. So a form of microgreen. Excellent question. Thank you.
All right, and back to containers. Do you need to clean your containers each year?
Yes, you should at least hose them out. Soap and water, if you have any kind of fungal disorder or disease that you've noticed in your plant, if it didn't do well, or if you've had an insect problem, you definitely want to wash those out with either just a mild soap and water. A lot of people like to also use a 10% bleach solution to sterilize their pots. You can do that as well, especially if you've had fungal issues. That's a good idea, is to sterilize them with a light bleach solution.
Great. And now on to a question about composting. What type of compost is recommended for herbs, mushrooms, etc.?
I'm sorry, the last part.
Herbs or mushrooms, etc.
I can't really speak to mushrooms. I don't have a lot of experience in that, in growing mushrooms, and it's a very different type of gardening with mushrooms. They're different type. They're a completely different type of organism. But any compost will do. If you have kitchen scraps that you compost, and we have a couple of really excellent, I think we actually have a really good composting on our YouTube channel right now on composting. So no matter what you're composting, that compost is pretty much going to be usable anywhere if it's done correctly and it's broken down enough. So even if you buy compost in a bag, and a lot of garden centers are doing that now, they sell compost in bags. If you want to do that, there's nothing wrong with it. I personally would rather make my own, but maybe you have a small space. But you can make a really good compost bin out of a trash can. And if you're interested in seeing how to do that, either give me a holler or check out our YouTube channel. I think we have those videos up for another week or so. And so there's an excellent program on composting, and we have experts that are really fantastic with composting, more knowledgeable than me for sure on composting.
And for those of us who've been lucky enough to visit the botanical garden, kind of know what treasure it is, what kind of a local gem it is. And the next question is it a coincidence that you live near the botanical garden, and do you ever have exhibits or plants there?
It is a happy coincidence. I was really excited when I realized I could walk there from my house. And we often do in the summer and spring. I can't wait until the roads are a little less icy to do that. But I spend a lot of time there, yes.
All right, back to containers. How do you keep your felt containers from drying out too fast?
They don't. And it's actually surprising. I ended up transitioning to a drip irrigation system for my tomatoes because tomatoes are heavy drinkers and I have a lot of them. So watering them is a really big chore. But when you have one or two containers, it really does not, they don't dry out any more than say clay pots would dry out. They do hold moisture really well.
Okay, and staying with the water theme here, for outdoor containers, how do you manage water content when it rains a lot?
You can put some kind of a makeshift cover over your plants, a tent of some sort to keep the rain off of them, or pull them into a more secure or more secure location where you're not going to have to worry about them getting overwatered.
Okay. And how do you feel about Alaska fish fertilizer? And next question also, what's your suggested planting method for potatoes in the reusable bags?
I actually have Alaska fish fertilizer over there with my other fertilizers. I love it. It's great. But there are a lot of really good fertilizers out there. So I'm hesitant to recommend one particular type of fertilizer, but I've used it and it's really effective. I like it more than say Miracle Grow, which tends to include a lot of salts in it. And especially for my house plants or container gardens, again, those salts can build up in that small area pretty quickly. And when that happens, your plants don't do well. What was the second part of that question? I got so distracted thinking about fertilizer.
Sure. What's your suggested planting method for potatoes in the reusable bags?
So I've tried my very first try with the potatoes was in the tires. That really, I really enjoyed that. I had a plastic liner in them and they did really well. And I loved it that I could add a new tire and make that bed bigger. But what I found is because of our growing season, we don't really need to plant tomatoes or potatoes super deep like they do say in the lower 48 where you have big mounds. pretty much our potatoes all grow at one level. So those bags work great. You can either fill them a little bit at a time. And what I'll do in that case is roll them down. So I just have a shallow container, put soil in them, put my potato starts in there. And then when the leaves come up to about the top of that fold, I unfold another layer, add some more soil on top. And that's how I grow mine in those potato bags. And like I said, if you know someone who has chickens or livestock or even pets, those pet food bags, the heavy duty ones make fantastic potato bags and you don't have to buy them.
Next question, do you add anything to the bottom of the pots that will help hold the soil and water instead losing soil through the large holes in the pots?
That's an excellent question. Yes, you can do that. Row cover works really well for that. Screening, any kind, if you have leftover screening from a construction project, you can use that. And similarly, if you're worried about you're not getting enough drainage, you can add something like pumice or lava rock or large grain vermiculite to the bottom of your containers to increase drainage. So you can control erosion and drainage by supplementing in that way. Good question.
Next one, back to compost. So this person has worm compost.
Oh, nice.
Would you use it the same as compost in soil? And then a follow-up, also how to use worm tea.
I'm not an expert on compost teas or worm waste teas, but it is, I think of it more like a liquid fertilizer. So the same way you would use a liquid fertilizer, the teas can be used as well as a way to water. Keep in mind though, that those are not necessarily going, compost tea especially is not necessarily going to include a lot of the macronutrients that your plants need. And that's something I can talk more on at another time. If you have any questions, like you can reach out. But the nice thing about the waste from worm farming is that it is relatively neutral. And so you can dig it right into that container while the plant's growing and supplement the top 3 to 6 inches of your soil with that during the growing season. So that could be nice, where sometimes, especially if you use a fertilizer or compost that has additional fertilizer in it, it can be too hot. Or even if it's just immature for compost that isn't old enough and hasn't broken down enough, that can actually be damaging to the plant. You don't necessarily have that problem with worm casings. So
I think you, speaking of composting, you may have mentioned a YouTube link earlier in some of your remarks, and someone was asking if it's possible to provide the link that you mentioned and drop it in chat if you happen to know or have yeah.
So I do see one of my coworkers on, and so
Okay.
I'm going to ask, is that possible that you could add that link to the chat?
That would be great. And it looks like someone's going to look for the link. So excellent.
Awesome.
And this is more of a comment, but maybe something that you'd like to talk about. Somebody said, my front porch seems to be too hot for tomatoes.
And that can be a problem. Tomatoes are fussy, and if it gets too hot, they will either drop their flowers or just not fruit at all. So my suggestion would be to use some kind of a shade barrier that you can pull down on during the hottest part of the days. I have the same problem in my greenhouse because of the way it faces. It can get, like, it's already up to 90 degrees in there right now. And by the time June comes around, it'll be 120, 130 in there. So using a fan to increase airflow is good, but also using some kind of a shade cloth to keep the hottest sun out, that will help control your temperatures.
Okay, great. And it looks like, I think one of your colleagues just wants to confirm that she's getting the correct YouTube link. It was on composting, and she's asking, was it on soil? And I think it was on composting. If we had that.
Yes, composting.
Okay, great. All right, I just want to check in with everyone. We've gone through a lot of questions. It felt like a speed round. But we are, it looks like we, always when we're here, you mentioned on YouTube when you talked about using a garbage can for composting.
Yes, Jody, one of my coworkers, she's out at the farm and she is amazing. She's a fantastic teacher and she knows more about compost than I probably have, ever learned. She's probably forgotten more about compost than I've ever learned. And she actually made a workable compost bin out of I think, was it a 35-gallon trash can, one of the large outdoor trash cans. And it works. So you don't need to have a huge compost pile to have usable compost.
Great. And it looks like Deshaun was able to find the YouTube link and drop it in there. So I think people can check the chat on that. I'm looking at it right now. So hopefully everybody has a chance to see that. And also, I did post the resource, and maybe Gina, you could hold that up again. It'd be hard for people to see, but could you kind of read us the title of that just real quickly, Gina?
Here, let me go ahead and make it a little easier to see.
That would be great.
For some reason, I can't stop sharing. There we go.
Okay. There.
Okay, so it's called Raising Vegetables in Mini Gardens, and it talks about, and it mostly focuses on container gardens. And so it's really fantastic. It has planting and thinning, recommended fertilizer routine, which also is the recommendation is liquid fertilizers because of the salt content in granular, how often you should water, the things that you should look for as far as insect and disease. And it has a chart on the back which gives you container sizes that you should use and how deep to plant those seeds if you're starting in the containers. Right. Instead of starting your seeds separately.
And I did paste that link in the chat again. I did see a comment that someone may have been having a challenge sort of getting the link to work, but other people have had success opening the link. So if you do have some difficulty, maybe you can try another browser perhaps. To see
One thing, actually, it's a little weird quirk with the way our publication links work. What will happen is when you click the link, it downloads the file. So it may not look like it's doing anything, but check your download folder and it will probably be right there.
Great information. Thanks for sharing that. Another possible location to find the link. And then looks like someone else has posted another ARP webinar on composting.
Oh, perfect. It's one of Jody's classes. She's great. She is so great.
Excellent. Whoever posted that, thank you so much for that. So I know we just have a few minutes left. Looks like we have another comment. Composting with kitchen scraps not always feasible with bears around, and we are approaching that time of year.
I've actually been told, and that is something to think about, but if you're composting correctly and not, I mean, I love a coworker, his name is Steve, says you're either composting or you're making a trash heap. And there is some truth to that. If you're not hot composting, then yes, you will have odor. And sometimes it gets slimy, sometimes it gets moldy, it can be funky. But if you're correctly composting, if you've got your ratios and you're watering it and you're turning it, it's not going to have a smell. And it's not going to be as attractive to bears as something that is just decomposing in its own way.
And on the smaller side of sort of the animal spectrum, we also said composting also attracts voles.
Yes, that it does. In fact, I opened my compost bin last year for the first time to see if I was able to turn it, and a vole ran across the top. I screamed, dropped my rake, and it took a few minutes to compose myself. My chickens went running after it, which was awesome. But yes, they will attract, especially if that food isn't breaking down quickly enough and you're putting food waste in it, they will attract small animals like voles.
Well, Gina, this has been incredibly informative. I want to thank you so much for spending the time with us today. It was a lot of information, went by very quickly, but I really appreciate you. I wish we had more time. I really appreciate you being with us today.
Well, I could talk about gardening all day, so it's a good thing that I have a time limit. So, but thank you so much.
Yeah, at some point people are going to need to get outside and actually, or inside, and actually start what they learned today. So
absolutely.
Yeah, great having you with us. And just want to let everyone know that there will be another presentation on April 13th on growing and cooking with herbs. That will be the next presentation in the gardening series. We're getting a lot of thank you comments, and smiles, and more thank yous are coming through, Gina. So this was obviously, appreciate that. But again, thanks so much for being with us. Again, people, please, for everyone who joined us today, and actually for anyone who registered, all those people will receive an email from ARP Alaska that includes a link to a copy of this or a recording of this, and also the resources that Gina highlighted today, as well as links to register for upcoming presentations in the ARP gardening series. So be on the lookout for that. Hopefully we'll see it in your inbox in the next 24 hours. If you don't, check your spam folder. And if you still don't see it, let us know. Happy to try again to get that information over to you. So with that, Gina, I'd love to give you the closing comments. Any final encouraging words of wisdom that you'd like to share with everyone as we wrap up today? Oh, you're on mute, Gina.
I have a tendency to do that. If you're starting, like if this is new for you, start small. And if you just have one tomato plant, a couple herbs, and you're new to, say, indoor gardening and you don't have your lighting yet, and start small and don't be disappointed if it doesn't quite turn out the way you want the first year. Gardening is something that is so personal for me as well. And I can't help it when the plants don't do well. I take it very personally, but don't, because learn from it. If they didn't do well, maybe you didn't have enough lighting, or maybe you overwatered. Learn from that. And then next year or next month, if you're going to be growing throughout the year, like I do, I keep fresh fruits and vegetables in the house. Well, fruit, not so much, but fresh vegetables and tomatoes all year round. So whenever you're planting, put what you learned into play and see if it's better, and take it like a learning process rather than, oh, I didn't do this. I hear so many people say, oh, I don't have a green thumb. Oh, I would kill anything. You probably won't, but sometimes you have to give it more than one try.
Great, perfect. Thanks so much for sharing that. And with that, we're going to go ahead and wrap things up today. Thanks again, Gina, for being with us, being our guest. Thanks to everyone who joined us. Want to wish you all a fruitful, yes, that's an intentional word, fruitful season this year. Hope all your gardens live up to all your expectations. And as Gina said, feel free to reach out and contact her with questions. Her email, and I think your email and your phone number, if I remember correctly, was in the chat also on the screen. So anyway, Gina, just a wonderful presentation. Thanks so much for sharing your time and your knowledge with us. And just wish everyone a really great spring and summer as we get out there and put everything we learned into practice today. So thanks so much, and have a great day, everyone.